She was on her knees in the dirt. Her hair lay in the dust around her. Her face had been marked so every person in town would know what she was and who she belonged to. 30 people watched. Not one of them moved. But one man turned the corner. And everything that came after began in that alley on a Tuesday morning in June 1876, the day Clara May Whitten decided she was done being something other people could erase. This is her story. There is a moment, and every person who has lived long enough knows this moment, when the world goes quiet in exactly the wrong way. Not the quiet of an early morning before the birds start. Not the quiet of a house after the children have gone to bed. Not the quiet of a Sunday when the town has gone to church and even the bodies have found shade. This is a different kind of quiet. The kind that fills a street when 30 people witness something they know is wrong and not one of them moves to stop it. The kind that has weight to it, that presses down on the shoulders of everyone present and leaves a mark that doesn't wash out easily. That was the quiet of Redstone Creek, Texas on the 14th of June, 1876. And that was the day everything changed. But we need to come to that moment from the right direction. Because to understand what happened in that alley, to understand why it mattered, why it still matters, you need to see it the way it was. Not the version that got cleaned up and spoken about in whispers at the Mercantile. Not the version Vera Langston told to anyone who would listen. The real version. The one that started 2 years earlier with a woman who had nowhere left to go and a signature on a piece of paper that she believed was the beginning of something new. It was not. Before we go back to the beginning, we need to go forward just a little. Forward to the end of this story so you understand what everything between was building toward. Picture a porch, 7 miles outside of Redstone Creek on a stretch of dry Texas land where the wind comes across the ridge in the afternoon and bends the tall grass like it's trying to tell you something important before the season changes. There is a man standing at the fence line. He is wearing a blue work shirt beneath a brown leather vest, both faded the way things get when they've been worn hard and often, and not for any occasion but the work itself, the kind of clothes that fit a man the way his own skin fits without ceremony. His hat casts a shadow across the upper half of his face. His jaw is set. He hasn't moved in several minutes, and the stillness about him is not the stillness of a man who is resting. It is the stillness of a man who has decided something. At the gate there is a woman. She is 28 years old. Her hair is cut ragged and uneven, barely reaching her ears, growing back in the uneven way hair grows when it has been taken from you rather than cut by choice. There is still a faint shadow along her left cheekbone where something dark was pressed into her skin not long ago. A shadow that is fading but not yet gone, like the memory of a hand that reached for you in the dark. She is standing on her own 2 feet. She is not shaking. Beside the man at the fence leans a rifle within reach, but not in hand. The woman at the gate stands with her arms loose at her sides, the way someone stands who has decided they will not be the one to lose. Facing them at the edge of the road, a wagon has stopped. A woman sits in the wagon bed rigid as new timber, a folded paper clutched in both hands, like it is the last thing of value she owns in the world. 2 men flank her on horseback. Behind them 2 more. The whole of Redstone Creek seems to be holding its breath. And to understand how a woman who arrived in this town with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a name signed to a contract she barely understood ended up standing at that gate with her chin level and her back straight, we have to go back. Back to where it started. Back to before. Clara May Whitten was 26 years old when she signed the mail-order bride contract. She sat at a table in a boarding house in Knoxville, Tennessee, with a stub of pencil in her hand and a kerosene lamp throwing yellow light across the page. The table was not hers. The lamp was not hers. The room she had been renting for 6 weeks was 3 days away from being no longer available to her, and the woman who ran the boarding house had stopped making eye contact when they passed in the hall, which was its own kind of message. She had no family left. Her father had died the previous winter, a hard winter, the kind that takes the old and the tired without particularly caring about the timing. Her mother had been gone since Clara was 9, taken by a fever that the doctor said he had seen before and had no good answer for. There were no brothers, no uncles, no cousins whose door she could knock on and be welcome. She had $12.40 in a tin box under the bed, a sewing kit, 2 dresses, and a stubbornness that had carried her this far and would need to carry her further than she could currently see. She read the advertisement 3 times before she answered it. It had appeared in a newspaper someone had left in the boarding house common room, folded back to the notices page, as if placed there by accident, or perhaps by the kind of providence that arranges things for women with nowhere else to look. Roy Langston, rancher, Redstone Creek, Texas, widower age 42, looking for a wife of good character, capable of hard work and household management. Age no concern, references available from the town reverend. She wrote him a letter. He wrote back. They exchanged 4 letters over the course of 2 months, each one, careful, each one more formal than warm, like two people negotiating the terms of a business arrangement, which was, she supposed, exactly what it was. Roy was not unkind in his letters. He was also not particularly present in them, the way some people are absent even when they are speaking directly to you. His words were brief and informational. He told her the ranch size, which was modest. He told her the nearest town was 12 miles. He told her the winters were dry. He did not tell her about the drinking. He did not tell her about his mother. She signed the contract in late autumn of 1873. The train ticket arrived 2 weeks later, enclosed in an envelope with no accompanying letter. Just the ticket and a scrap of paper with the depot address in Redstone Creek, written in a hand that pressed hard on the pen. She packed everything she owned into a single bag and stepped off the platform on a December morning with cold air filling her lungs and something she was trying very hard to call hope. Roy Langston met her at the depot. He was a tall man, thin in the way men get when they work too hard and eat too little, and have been doing both long enough that the body has simply accepted it as its natural condition. His face might have been handsome once and was now just tired, the kind of tired that lives in the eyes and around the mouth and does not lift when you smile. He shook her hand at the depot like she was a business associate. He took her bag without comment. He said very little on the ride out to the ranch, and what he said was about the weather and the condition of the road, and nothing that required any particular response. She thought, this is how it begins. I can work with this. His mother, Vera, was waiting at the house. Clara would remember that first moment for the rest of her life. Not because it was dramatic, it was in fact entirely quiet. Just a woman standing in the doorway of a ranch house with her arms crossed watching them come up the track. But the quality of Vera Langston's watching was unlike anything Clara had encountered before. Her eyes moved over Clara from hat to boot with a careful, unhurried assessment of someone pricing livestock at a county fair, not hostile, not welcoming, just deeply and thoroughly evaluating. She was 56 years old, heavy-set with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull the expression off her face and leave behind something flat and deliberate, like a mask made of patience. "Welcome to Redstone Creek," Vera said. She said it the way you say a thing you have decided to say because someone needs to say it, not because you mean it in any way that could be held to. Roy died 8 months after the wedding. He fell from his horse on a February evening, drunk enough that he likely did not feel the fall, or the mud, or the cold that followed. By the time Clara found him in the yard, she had been waiting up because waiting up was safer than sleeping. When she didn't know where he was, he had been lying in the mud long enough that his lips were the color of a November sky, and nothing could be done. She ran for the nearest neighbor. The neighbor ran for the doctor. The doctor arrived and said the things doctors say when they arrive too late and have said those things enough times that the words come out without weight. Vera was on the porch when they brought Roy inside. She stood very still and looked at her son for a long moment, the way you look at something you knew was coming and have been waiting for without admitting you were waiting. Then she looked at Clara. "He was drinking again because of you." That was the first thing Vera Langston said after her son died, not to the doctor, not to anyone else in the room, just to Clara, quietly, with the particular precision of a woman who understood that the most effective words are the ones delivered so softly that only the intended person can hear them. And Clara, who was standing in a strange house, in a strange county, with mud on her boots and a husband she had barely known, now laid out on the kitchen table, did not have a single word to say in return. She held still. She would learn in the months that followed that holding still was the safest thing she could do. The Langston family did not send Clara away after Roy died. This might have seemed to an outside observer like an act of generosity, or at least of basic human decency. It was neither. Vera needed someone to manage the household, the cooking, the washing, the mending, the garden, the chickens, the 100 small tasks that held a working ranch together from the inside while the men handled the outside work. She needed someone to take the blame when the crops failed, or the hens stopped laying, or the weather turned mean, which it did regularly and without apology in that part of Texas. She needed someone small enough to hold on to someone without allies, without family, without anywhere to go. Clara was all of those things. For 2 years, she worked from before dawn until after dark. She ate last after Vera and Holton Wade had taken what they wanted from the table, on the logic never stated, simply enacted that the woman who cooked the food was the last to need it. She slept in a room no larger than a storage closet on a straw mattress that smelled of dust and old unhappiness, with a door that had no lock and a window that let in the cold in winter, because the frame had warped and nobody had found reason to fix it. She was not beaten regularly. Vera was too careful and too deliberate for that, understood too well that marks were evidence, and evidence was liability. But there were moments, a hand on her arm that gripped too hard and held too long, a shove when no one else was in the room, a silence at mealtimes that was wielded like a tool, words delivered in a tone that left bruises of a different kind, the kind that don't fade in 2 weeks and cannot be shown to a doctor. She was not by any legal definition a prisoner, but she could not leave. She had no money. Vera controlled the household accounts with the thoroughness of someone who understood that financial dependence is the most effective kind of cage because it requires no lock. Clara had no horse of her own. The geldings were ranch property used for ranch work, and borrowing one required a reason that Vera could evaluate and approve or deny. The nearest town was 12 miles of open Texas scrubland in every direction, and in the summer that was a walk that could kill you before you reached halfway if you started without water and didn't start early enough. And Vera had made very certain through quiet conversations with the women at the mercantile and the men at the feed store, through the particular way she shook her head when Clara's name came up, and the careful words she used that never quite became an accusation, but left the shape of one hanging in the air. Vera had made certain that everyone in Redstone Creek understood exactly who Clara Langston was. A woman from nowhere. A woman who had somehow driven a good man to drink, or at least had not managed to stop him. A woman who should be grateful for the roof over her head and the food in her stomach, whatever there was of it, and the patience of a family who kept her despite everything. The town believed her. Towns usually do believe the person who has been there longest and speaks loudest with the quietest voice. Clara wrote the letter to the lawyer in Abilene 6 weeks before the day in the alley. She had found Thaddeus Mercer's name in an old newspaper someone had left at the feed store. Thaddeus Mercer, attorney at law, Abilene, Texas, widows' rights and property claims. She took the newspaper home folded under her arm like it was nothing. She wrote the letter by lamplight after Vera and the boys had gone to bed, her hand moving carefully across the paper the way her father had taught her. Say what you mean what you say. Don't waste a line on anything that won't hold up in daylight. She asked about widows' rights under Texas territorial law. She asked whether a dead man's family could compel a widow to remain in their household. She asked what a woman in her situation was legally entitled to claim and how she would go about claiming it. She hid the letter in the straw of her mattress. She also hid a copy of her marriage certificate. She had gotten it from Reverend Hatch 2 months earlier on the pretext of needing it for a county record, a vague enough reason that Hatch had accepted it without much question. She folded it small and pressed it between the mattress and the wooden frame. Vera found the letter 3 days later. What Clara did not yet know, what she would not discover until she was sitting in a stranger's cabin 7 miles from town with the contents of her small bag spread on the table before her, was that Vera had not found the letter by accident. She had been searching the room. Systematically, methodically, over the course of several weeks, going through the mattress straw and the thin shelf above the door and the single drawer in the closet room with the patience of a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing a cornered person can acquire is information about their own situation. She had found the marriage certificate first. She had burned it the same night alone in the kitchen stove, feeding it in slowly and watching it until it was nothing but ash that she stirred with the poker and left to mix with everything else. She had done this not in anger, but in the measured, unhurried way. She did everything as a step in a plan she had been building long before the letter to the lawyer, long before the shears, long before the day in the alley. The letter to the lawyer had simply confirmed that she was not moving fast enough. But that discovery was still to come. First came the alley. The 14th of June arrived like every other day in a Texas summer, without apology and without shade, the heat establishing itself early and thoroughly pressing down on the town of Redstone Creek. until the air between the buildings shimmered and smelled of dust and horse and dried wood baking in the sun. By mid-morning, there was no comfortable place to stand outdoors, and nowhere inside that was much better, and the flies were bad near the stables, and everyone in town was moving a little slower than they might have otherwise. Clara was on her knees before the first cut came. Vera had brought a stool into the alley between the livery stable and the feed store. She had told Clara to sit on it, voice carrying the flat certainty of a woman who had never needed to repeat an instruction because the consequences of not following it were always understood. When Clara had not moved fast enough, her feet had frozen just for a moment, the way feet do when the body understands something before the mind has caught up. Wade Langston had put both hands on her shoulders from behind and driven her down onto the hard-packed dirt instead. The stool sat unused behind her as if the original plan had already evolved into something worse before it had properly begun. The shears Vera used were dull. That was the thing Clara kept returning to afterward, in the weeks that followed, when she had the distance to look at what had happened with something like clarity. Not the pain itself, not the crowd, not the smell of the paste Holt pressed into her skin with his wide, grease-dark fingers. The shears were dull, the kind you would use on a sheep. You did not particularly care about cutting cleanly, the kind that pulled and dragged, rather than cut that made the work slow and deliberate and unmistakably intentional. Each pass sawed through another lock of her auburn hair, and the strands fell into the dust between her knees and lay there catching the light, like something discarded, something that had been taken because someone could take it, and for no better reason than that. Vera worked in silence at first, which was worse than if she had spoken. The silence had a quality to it, a concentration, the focus of a woman doing something she had thought about doing for some time and was now carrying out with the satisfaction of the methodical. Holt stood to Clara's right holding a tin bucket. Clara knew what was in it before he tilted it. She had seen them mix it that morning in the barn. Ash from the stove stirred thoroughly into axle grease until it became a paste, the color and consistency of something you would not want anywhere near your skin. She had seen it, and she had understood, with a coldness that settled into her chest like water finding its level. Whatever was coming was going to be worse than what had come before. The crowd had gathered the way crowds gather in small towns when they sense something is happening that they will later have to decide whether they witnessed. 20 people, perhaps more. Women she recognized from the mercantile, their faces arranged in the careful, neutral expression of people who have convinced themselves that watching is not the same as participating. Men who tipped their hats to Clara on Sunday mornings and now could not seem to find her eyes. Old Clem, the dry goods hauler, standing at the back of the gathered people with his arms folded and his face carved into something that was not quite expressionless, not quite anything else, the face of a man who was seeing something clearly and had not yet decided what to do with what he was seeing. No one moved. "You think you're something, don't you?" Vera said. Her voice was pitched to carry. She had the gift of a woman who had spent decades ensuring that rooms went quiet when she spoke. "Think because you can scratch out letters like a school teacher. Think because Roy married you, that makes you something other than what you are." The shears caught on a knot near the back of Clara's head. Her skull jerked sideways hard. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste iron and did not make a sound. "My Roy is barely cold," Vera announced to the crowd, turning slightly so the words reached further. "And she has been writing letters to a lawyer in Abilene, asking about property rights. Property that belongs to this family and has always belonged to this family." A murmur moved through the gathered people like wind moving through dry grass, the sound of a crowd adjusting its understanding of a situation, shifting its sympathies in the direction of the voice that was speaking most confidently. Clara stared at the dust between her hands, which she had pressed flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. Holt stepped forward with the bucket. He hesitated just for a moment, a fraction of a breath, and his eyes met Clara's, and something moved through his expression that was not kindness, but was perhaps related to it, a brief and uncomfortable awareness that whatever line existed between discipline and cruelty, his mother was crossing it without looking down. Then he dipped his hand into the bucket. He pressed his fingers against Clara's jaw and turned her face toward the crowd. The paste was cold where it first made contact. It went on in long strokes that smelled of char and machinery and something animal underneath, and when it dried, it would pull the skin tight and dark and mark her in a way that would be visible to anyone who looked at her, anyone who passed her on the street. so that they would know without being told that this had not been her choice and had been done to make a point about what she was and who she belonged to. Clara closed her eyes. She thought of her father. She thought of the workshop window in Knoxville, the afternoon light coming through it at the angle it came in October, and his voice saying the only thing he ever said that had traveled with her every mile, since words are the only thing they can't take from you. A man can take your land, your money, your name, your dignity in a public alley, but he can't unread what you've already read, and he can't unthink what you've already thought. They were trying to unread her now. Open your eyes, Vera said. You look at these people. You let them see what happens to a woman who forgets her place. Clara opened her eyes. The faces swam before her, familiar faces. Faces she had seen every week for 2 years. Faces she had smiled at and nodded to and handed packages to and accepted greetings from. Mrs. Aldred from the dry goods, clutching her shawl in both hands, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The Fletcher boy, no more than 12 at the edge of the crowd, with his jaw hanging open and his eyes wide, with the particular stunned expression of a child seeing something for the first time that he will spend years afterward trying to categorize. Old Clem at the back, still folded into himself, watching with the careful, serious attention of a man who was recording everything. And then at the very edge of the crowd, at the mouth of the alley, where it opened onto the main street, a space, a gap that had not been there a moment before. The kind of space that opens when someone enters, who changes the way a room organizes itself, not because they demand it, but because their presence makes the previous arrangement no longer possible. A man stood at the edge of the alley. He was tall, carrying himself with the kind of stillness that does not come from effort, but from something foundational, from being somewhere down at the core of things, simply at rest in a way that most people never achieve. He wore a blue work shirt beneath a brown leather vest, both worn soft by years of weather and labor, and a specific kind of daily use. The blue faded to the color of the sky in the hour before rain, when it goes flat and deep and entirely itself. His hat cast a shadow over the upper portion of his face, but his jaw was visible beneath it, and his jaw was set like something that has been subjected to considerable force over considerable time and has decided not to move. He was holding a busted hinge for a corral gate in his left hand, which told a story all by itself, a man on his way to fix something ordinary who had turned a corner and found this instead. He must have heard whatever sound travels through a Texas alley on a hot morning when something is wrong, the particular quality of a crowd gone quiet around something it doesn't want to name. He did not push through the crowd. He did not need to. People moved for him the way water moves around a rock that has been in the creek for a long time, not because they are afraid of the rock, but because the rock has been there long enough that the water has accepted it as part of the geography and finds the easier path around it without any particular decision being made. Then his voice. Take your hands off her. He was not loud. He did not need volume because the alley had gone quiet in a very specific way, the way a room goes quiet when someone does something unexpected and the air itself seems to stop to see what comes next. His voice fell into that quiet, low and flat, and with the quality of a statement rather than a request, the kind of words that are not asking your opinion because the speaker has already determined what is going to happen and is merely informing you of the timeline. Vera turned to face him. The shears were still in her fist held at her side. This is family business, Mr. Cole. Doesn't look like family business. He looked at Clara then. Not at the paste on her face, not at the ruined hair, not at the bucket or the shears or any of the visible evidence of what had been done. He looked at her eyes the way you look at a person when you want them to understand that you are seeing the person and not the circumstances surrounding them. Looks like a woman being held against her will in the middle of the street. Something shifted in the crowd. The quality of the air changed in a way that was subtle but distinct, the way it changes in the moment before a summer storm when the pressure drops and the birds stop their noise and everything goes briefly, pointedly still. Clara watched it happen without fully understanding. It did not understand the way faces changed when Elijah Cole spoke, the way some of them dropped their eyes toward the ground, the way several of the men at the back of the alley suddenly discovered pressing reasons to be somewhere else. She's kin, Holt said, straightening. She married my brother. Your brother's dead. The words fell into the silence the way a stone falls into still water, with a sound that is small and a consequence that spreads. Holt's face went dark and his hand came away from Clara's jaw, fingers curling at his side. The paste on her cheek had begun to dry, and she could feel it pulling. Elijah set the busted hinge down on a barrel near the alley wall. The movement was slow and deliberate in a way that was itself a statement, the freeing of both hands for whatever came next done without hurry or theatrics. And then he took a step not toward Vera, not toward Holt, not toward the crowd, but toward Clara. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice dropped to something that was meant only for her, pitched so that only she could hear it beneath the ambient sound of the street. "Can you stand?" Clara looked up at him. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am, you don't." Then why? He was quiet for a beat. From somewhere on the main street, a horse shifted and a sign creaked, and a dog barked once at something and stopped. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small Texas town, entirely indifferent to what was happening in an alley between the livery and the feed store. Because nobody else is going to. Something broke open inside her chest. Not warmth, not quite hope, not anything that had a clean name yet, but the space where those things might eventually grow if the conditions became right, if she was given enough time and enough ground to stand on. She reached for the edge of the overturned stool and pressed herself to standing. Her knees shook. Her vision went briefly white at the edges. But she stood. Vera took a step toward her. "You sit back down. We are not finished." Her name, Elijah said, not turning around, is Clara. "And yeah, you are." Holt moved then, smooth and practiced, putting himself between Elijah and his mother in the way of a man who has done this before, who has served as the barrier between Vera and whatever she was about to collide with. His hand dropped to the grip of the revolver at his hip. Not drawing, just letting the weight and position of his hand make its own statement. "Mr. Holt said, I am going to give you one chance to walk away from this." Elijah's gaze moved to Holt's hand, then up to his face. He had not raised his voice once, had not shifted his stance or squared his shoulders in the way men do when they are positioning themselves for a fight they want to have. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "I mean that sincerely." "So do I." He stood the way a fence post stands, not because it is about to do something, but because it was put in the ground to stay there and has no intention of coming out. "You want to draw on me over a woman you have been covering with axle grease in the middle of the street," he said. "That's your choice to make. But I would think carefully about how that story sounds when people tell it later. Because people will tell it." Holt's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes, calculation, or something close to shame, or both. Behind him, Vera said something low and sharp that didn't carry far enough to hear clearly. It was old Clem who spoke first from the back of the crowd, pushing off from the wall he had been leaning against and unfolding his arms in the manner of a man who has made a decision about something he has been thinking about for long enough. "I seen that quilt she's accused of stealing." Old Clem said, addressing nobody in particular, while somehow addressing everyone at once. "Seen her stitching it on the porch of the Langston place last winter. Watched her at it more than once. That pattern is not Vera Langston's work. Everybody who's been paying attention knows whose hands made that quilt." Vera's face went white, then red. The two colors chased each other across her features. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling what I saw," Old Clem said mildly. He went back to leaning against the wall. The crowd had changed. Something in it had shifted with the weight of those few sentences, the way a scale tips when you add one final small thing to one side, and the whole balance changes. Vera looked around the alley, searching for an ally, a face that would hold with her, someone who would confirm what she needed confirmed. Mrs. Aldred looked at the ground. The Fletcher boy found something interesting to study on his shoes. The men at the back of the alley had already found their pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Elijah did not wait for the argument to find its resolution. He reached up and pulled the neckerchief from around his throat, faded blue worn soft by years of sweat and sun and daily use, and held it out to Clara. Not draped over her shoulders, not pressed into her hands, simply held it out at the space between them and let her decide. She took it. Her fingers brushed against his as she did, and she felt the calluses there, the thick, layered texture of a man whose hands had been doing hard work for a long time without complaint. She pressed the cloth to her cheek, and the black paste came away in long, dark smears against the blue fabric. "Come on," Ma Holt said quietly, and his voice was different now, lower, depleted. He reached for Vera's arm. She shook him off once, but the gesture had already gone out of it. The performance was over. The audience had rearranged itself in a direction she hadn't intended, and Vera Langston, whatever else she was, understood when a position could no longer be held. She turned. She walked stiff back through what remained of the crowd without looking at anyone, the shears still clenched in her right fist. Holt a step behind her. Wade followed with his face closed and danger row, his eyes finding Elijah's for exactly 1 second before he looked away. Clara watched them go. Then it was just her and Elijah Cole and the scattered remains of her hair lying in the dust of the alley floor, and the heat pressing down from above, and the sound of the town resuming its ordinary business as if nothing had happened. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so. My horse is at the rail by the mercantile." She took a step. Her ankle turned on a loose stone and her weight went sideways. His hand was there immediately, not grabbing, not gripping, just flat and steady near her elbow. There if she needed it, and gone the moment she had her balance. She righted herself and kept walking. When they came out of the alley and the full force of the afternoon sun hit her, she flinched. It felt too bright, too open, too much of everything all at once, like walking out of a cave after a very long time in the dark and finding the world still startling. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "My place. 7 miles out on the creek road." "Why?" "Because they will come looking for you before this hour is done. And there is nowhere in this town that will keep them out if they decide to come in." She stopped and looked at him. This man she had seen 100 times from a distance over 2 years and heard speak perhaps half a dozen words in total. There were deep lines around his eyes, the kind that come from more than weather, from years of squinting into something bright and painful and not looking away. A scar along the knuckle of his right hand healed long ago to something white and smooth. Shoulders that carried themselves like they had been bearing weight for a long time and had adjusted to it without resentment. She noticed the way the few people still visible on the main street behaved around him. Not with fear exactly, not with the wariness you show someone dangerous. Something more complicated, a deliberate distance, the careful avoidance of a town that has made a collective decision about a person and maintains that decision through the daily discipline of not looking directly at him. She would ask about it later. For now, she said yes. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the gelding, a tall, steady animal the color of wet sand, with the calm, intelligent eyes of a horse that has been well treated for a long time and knows it. He reached down with one hand, palm open. She took it, and he pulled her up behind the saddle with a strength that was matter-of-fact about itself, like effort was simply not a concept that applied. "You can hold on if you need to," he said, not looking back. "I won't think anything of it." She kept her grip on the back of the saddle. Not yet. They rode out of Redstone Creek at a walk, and the town folded up behind her like a letter she had finished reading and did not particularly need again. The road was pale dust, cutting straight through sage and dry grass under a sky that was the deep, uninterrupted blue of a Texas afternoon without clouds. After a mile, she loosened her grip on the leather. After 2 miles, she let her hands rest in her lap. After 3, she said, "Mr. Cole." "Elijah," he said, not looking back. "Elijah, why does the town look at you the way they do?" He did not answer right away. The gelding kept his steady rhythm on the packed earth, and the silence stretched in a way that might have been uncomfortable with someone else. But with Elijah simply had the quality of a man who doesn't answer until he knows what he wants to say. 8 years ago, he said, finally a man died in Redstone Creek. People decided I was responsible. The judge didn't convict. There wasn't enough to convict on. But deciding and convicting are different things, and a town only needs to decide. She absorbed this. Was it true what they decided? No. She believed him. She wasn't entirely certain why she believed him so quickly and so completely. But she did. Perhaps because a man who lies about himself typically ornaments the lie, adds texture and detail, makes it more sympathetic than a simple flat denial. Perhaps because she had spent 2 years in a house with a woman who lied with the ease and frequency of breathing and had developed in that time a sensitivity to the feel of truth that was as reliable as any other instrument. "Do you know who did it?" she asked. Yes. She waited. He did not offer more. The cabin was at the end of a long, unpaved track off the creek road, sitting in a clearing of dry grass surrounded by a split-rail fence that someone had built with genuine care and kept in good repair. The windmill behind the barn was turning in the afternoon heat, making its familiar sound against the dry air. A garden plot beside the south fence had been worked with the attention of someone who took growing things seriously and understood that patience was as important as the effort. Elijah was off the gelding before it had fully stopped, turned, and offered his hand. Clara took it and let herself down. Her boots hit the ground and her knees nearly buckled. He steadied her with one hand, without comment, the way you steady something that is going to be fine in a moment and doesn't need to be made into a situation. Sit, he said, nodding toward a bench beside the cabin door. I'll bring water. She sat not because he said so, but because her legs had taken all the day they were going to take and were done now. Her hands had begun to shake with a fine involuntary tremor that she could not stop no matter how tightly she pressed them together. The neckerchief was still balled in her fist, the black stains already drying to stiff dark patches in the blue cloth. Elijah came back from inside carrying a tin basin and a clean rag, the water sloshing against the rim. He set them beside her on the bench and stepped back. Did not crouch down to her level, did not hover over her with concern that would feel like another kind of management. Just set down the tools and gave her the space. For your face, he said. Then he walked toward the barn, and she heard the door creak open and his voice murmuring low to the gelding, the tone of a man who speaks to animals as a matter of genuine communication rather than performance. Clara dipped the rag and pressed it to her cheek. The water was cool, drawn from the well, and not yet warmed by the heat of the day. The paste came away slowly, stubbornly, requiring more pressure than she wanted to use. Each pass of the cloth felt like she was removing something deeper than grease and ash, some accumulated coating of the last 2 years, as all the things she had been told she was and had been unable to refuse because refusing required somewhere else to go, and she had had nowhere. Her reflection wavered in the basin water, broken and unsteady. She barely recognized herself. The hair was the worst of it, not because she was vain. She had never been vain. About her hair had worn it plain her whole adult life, but because Vera had cut it the way she had cut it on purpose with deliberate unevenness, so that anyone who saw Clara would know at a glance that it had not been her choice. That was always the point. Not the act itself, but the visibility of it, the public record of it, written on her body where everyone could read it. She wrung out the rag. The water in the basin turned gray, then black. She lifted it and poured it off the edge of the porch. When Elijah came back from the barn, she was sitting with her hands flat on her knees, her face raw and clean, her jaw set. Thank you, she said, for the water. He nodded. You hungry? No. You should eat anyway. I said I'm not hungry. He looked at her for a moment, and she found herself bracing for what she had learned to watch for in the faces of men who had just done something considerate and wanted credit for it. The slight compression at the corners of the mouth, the blink that was harder than it needed to be, the shift in expression that meant, I have been reasonable, and your failure to appreciate it is an offense. She had seen that expression so many times it had worn grooves in her. Elijah said, all right, and went inside. She sat on the porch while the afternoon light began its slow change toward evening. Flies circled near the water trough by the barn. A hen investigated something in the dirt near the fence. From inside, she heard the quiet sounds of a man moving carefully in a small space, the scrape of a pot, the thud of a cabinet door, the particular sound of a kettle placed exactly where it had always been placed. After a while, the smell of coffee reached her, and her stomach made a sound she decided to ignore. She stood up and went inside. The cabin was one room with a doorway leading to a smaller room beyond a table with 2 chairs, a stove shelves holding the sparse and orderly possessions of a man who had made peace with needing very little. Everything was clean in the way of things that are used consistently by the same person over a long time and have taken on the precise shape of their habits. Nothing had been rearranged for someone else's comfort because no one else had been here to rearrange anything for. Elijah set a tin cup on the table without ceremony. She wrapped both hands around it and drank. The coffee was strong enough to strip the finish off furniture, and it was the best thing she had tasted in 2 years. I need to tell you something, she said. So you know what you've walked into. He sat down across from her. You don't owe me any explanation. This isn't about owing, it's about fair warning. She set the cup down and told him everything. She told him about Roy, about the drinking, which had preceded her arrival to Texas by at least 20 years. If the evidence of the man she had married could be trusted about the night he fell in the yard, and she found him in the mud, about the words Vera had said to her in the doorway in the hours after, and what those words had established for the 2 years that followed. She told him about the work without wages, the food withheld the first time 6 months ago, that Vera had produced the shears in the kitchen. She told him about Holt, who had been asking to marry her since the month after Roy's funeral. Not cruelly, not with open force, but with the quiet, patient, entirely unstoppable pressure of a man who had been taught that persistence was the same as earning something. She told him about the letter. Elijah listened without interrupting. When she finished, the coffee had gone cool between them, and the light through the window had turned amber. The letter to the lawyer in Abilene, he said. Did he write back? I don't know. Vera found my letter before any reply could arrive. Then we write again. He said it the way you say a thing when the logic of it is plain, and elaboration would only dilute it. This time we make sure it reaches him. She looked at him across the table. This man who had stepped into an alley for a woman he did not know, who had spoken more words to her in the last 2 hours than she had heard him speak to anyone in 2 years. Why, she said, I need a real answer. Not the one you gave me in the alley. He looked at the table for a long time, then at the window where the last of the evening light was going the color of cooling coals. I had a wife, he said, Margaret, and a daughter, Eliza. She was 3 years old. Clara went very still. They got the fever while I was at Shiloh, both of them. By the time the letter found me, they had been in the ground for 2 weeks. He said it the way you say something you have said to yourself so many thousands of times that the words have lost their edges, worn smooth and flat, just the shape of the thing stripped of everything but the essential fact. I came home to a house with their clothes still hanging on the pegs, a cradle I had built with my own hands in the corner of the room. He paused. I could not save them, could not even be there to hold their hands when it came. He turned and looked at her directly. That is the whole of it, Clara. I was too far away once, and it cost me everything I had. And when I saw you in that alley, I was close enough to do something. That is the entire reason. I was close enough this time. She did not speak. There was nothing she could say that was equal to what he had just placed between them. So she reached across the table and laid her hand on his forearm just for a moment, just long enough for him to know she had heard every word of it. He looked down at her hand. Then he nodded, the quiet nod of a man whose insides have shifted and found a new position, not healed but resting differently than before. Outside the window, the light had gone entirely. The road back to Redstone Creek was dark. And somewhere in that town, 7 miles away, Vera Langston sat alone in the kitchen, with the lamp turned down low, thinking about what came next, with the patience of a woman who believed she had already won and was simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same understanding. She had found Clara's copy of the marriage certificate 2 months ago. She had burned it the same night in the stove, methodically, without hurry or drama. The letter to the lawyer had simply told her she needed to accelerate a timeline she had already been building. She did not know about the man in the blue shirt and the brown leather vest. She did not know what he had survived, what he had lost, or what he had decided 14 years ago about the kind of man he was going to be once the grief had finished its initial work on him. She did not know that the woman she had spent 2 years making small was sitting 7 miles away at a stranger's table, holding a cup of terrible coffee in both hands and feeling for the first time in as long as she could remember, like the ground under her feet might be something she was actually allowed to stand on. That night, Clara sat at the table after Elijah had settled onto his bedroll near the stove, and she took a piece of paper from the drawer. He showed her some old paper, yellowed at the edges, soft as cloth, and she set a pencil stub to it. She wrote carefully, every word chosen the way her father had taught her to choose words one at a time for weight and precision. She wrote to Thaddeus Mercer, attorney at law, Abilene, Texas, about widows' rights under territorial law, about a family that had withheld what legally belonged to her, about a marriage she was certain had been recorded before a reverend in a church with witnesses present and half the town in attendance, and about the need to understand what standing she had under the law and what tools the law was prepared to give her to defend it. When she finished, she read it aloud quietly to herself in the dark of the cabin, while the fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and from the main room came the sound of Elijah breathing in the slow and even rhythm of a man who has done enough in a day to sleep without difficulty. The words held up. She folded the letter and left it on the table. Tomorrow they would ride to Miller's Crossing, 12 miles in the direction away from Redstone Creek, 12 miles where nobody owed the Langston family anything. She would send this letter, and she would wait, and whatever came back would either give her something to fight with or show her how much further there was still to go. She was prepared for either answer. She had learned in the last 2 years that preparation was not something that happened to you. It was something you chose in the dark with whatever you had and held on to until you could use it. She blew out the lamp. She lay down on the narrow bed in the small room on a mattress that smelled of cedar and clean soap. Nothing like the straw tick at the Langston house, nothing like the smell of dust and old whiskey and years of constrained misery that she had slept on for 2 years. From the main room came the quiet sound of Elijah shifting on his bedroll. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, nobody was sleeping between her and the door to keep her in. 3 days passed before the first rider appeared on the road. 3 days in which Clara learned the rhythm of the place, the pump before dawn, the coffee already on the particular quality of morning light on the south pasture that was different from anything she had seen from the Langston house, because from the Langston house she had rarely been awake early enough to choose to look at the light. 3 days in which she cleaned the chicken coop with her bare hands and hauled out the old straw and scrubbed the trough until the rust came away in long streaks and laid down fresh bedding she found in the barn, while the hens watched her with the skeptical expression of animals that had been disappointed by people before. 3 days in which she made cornbread from the stores in Elijah's cabinet and learned that his kitchen had good instincts built into it. The cast iron seasoned right. The flour kept dry, the salt in a covered container that actually kept the moisture out. On the morning of the fourth day, Clara woke to the sound of the pump and dressed and brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch and found Elijah already there, sleeves rolled, filling the morning buckets with the unhurried motion of a man who has done this 10,000 times. He crossed the yard and took the cup with a nod. They stood in the early light without speaking, which was fine. The sky was deciding what color it was going to be. A pair of hawks circled something in the far pasture. The land stretched out in every direction, gold and brown and gray, at the edges where the sage grew thick. "I'm going to need to work," Clara said. "I cannot sit on this porch and wait for things to happen." Elijah looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Chickens need tending," he said. "East fence needs another pair of hands. And whatever you did to that cornbread," he paused for exactly the right length of time, "you could do that again. Was it good?" "It was considerably better than anything I have eaten in 8 years. That is a genuinely low standard, Elijah." The corner of his mouth shifted towards something that a smile might eventually grow into if the conditions remained favorable. They finished the coffee. She went to the coop. She cleaned it the way she did every job she chose to do thoroughly without being asked and without anyone watching to see if she was doing it correctly. When she finished, she stood in the yard with her hands on her hips and felt something in her chest that she had almost completely forgotten, the specific foundational satisfaction of having done something, because she decided to on her own time for her own reasons. Elijah came past on his way to the fence line, a coil of wire over his good shoulder. He glanced at the cleaned coop. He glanced at her. The nod he gave her was slower and weightier than the nods before it, the kind that carries real information. She went inside to start the midday meal. The rider came into view at mid-morning. Clara saw the dust column from the south window single and unhurried the dust of purpose rather than urgency. She set down the wooden spoon and stood watching. Elijah came around the barn corner and stopped when he saw it, and a moment later he went inside and came back out without the fence wire. He came back with the rifle instead, angled at the ground, his face arranged into the particular careful stillness he wore, the way some men wear hats naturally without effort, as a basic condition of being outdoors. They stood on the porch together and waited. The rider crested the low rise before the gate and came into focus, a man in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders and comfortable in the saddle, with a mustache going more gray than brown and a badge catching the morning light on his chest. He rode a bay mare the way you ride a horse you've been riding for years on the same roads. Sheriff Brent Calloway drew up at the fence and tipped his hat. "Cole, ma'am," Sheriff Elijah said. Calloway reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out without dismounting, which told Clara something about how he felt about delivering it. A man who agreed with his errand got off his horse. "Got a complaint filed by Vera Langston," he said. "Says you took her daughter-in-law without consent. Says there's stolen property to recover." He looked at Clara. "Says this woman belongs back in the family household." Clara stepped forward before Elijah could speak. "Write this down, Sheriff," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected it to, steadier than anything in her body felt. I left the Langston house of my own will and on my own feet because I chose to leave it. I was not taken and I was not carried. I walked to Mr. Cole's horse and I got on it because the alternative was remaining in an alley while my hair was cut off with dull shears and my face was covered in axle grease and ash, which is what had just been done to me in front of witnesses in the middle of a Tuesday morning. She paused. "Write that down too," she said. Calloway studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elijah. Then he produced a small notebook from his breast pocket and a pencil. "I heard about the alley," he said, and he wrote while he talked. "I've heard about most things that happen in this county within roughly 6 hours of their occurring. The complaint also lists stolen property. Clothing silver, a quilt I left in the dress I'm wearing," Clara said. "The quilt Vera Langston is calling stolen is one I made with my own hands across 2 winters. She can have it back. I don't need anything from that house except what the law says is already mine." Calloway finished writing. He capped the pencil. He looked at Vera's complaint, folded it, put it back. "Here is where I stand," he said. "I have a widow who says she left on her own. I have a family that says she was taken. I have no evidence of stolen property and a street full of people who witnessed what the Langston family did in that alley." He looked at both of them evenly. "I am inclined to let this lie, but Vera Langston is already in conversation with Judge Harkins about a writ, and if she obtains one, I will have to come back, and that visit will be a different kind of conversation than this one." He tipped his hat to Clara and turned the mare back toward the road. Calloway's hoofbeats faded. The dust settled. Clara sat down on the bench, and her hands had started the shaking again, the involuntary tremor she could not stop, and she pressed them flat against her thighs. Elijah set the rifle against the wall and stood near her. Not too close, leaving her the room. "A writ means nothing without evidence," he said. "You don't know Vera." Her voice was tight. "She'll find evidence. She'll construct it if she needs to. She has been building things her whole life, building the story of who I am, building the town's understanding of me, building the legal and social ground she needs, so that when she moves against someone, nobody in a position to stop her is inclined to do it. The letter, the alley, all of it, that wasn't anger Elijah. That was architecture." He was quiet for a moment. "Then we make sure the truth is louder than what she builds," he said. "How the lawyer in Abilene. Did Reverend Hatch record the marriage in the county register?" "Yes, I stood before him in the church in Redstone Creek. There were witnesses, half the town attended. Then there is a record. Marriage certificates get filed with the county at Miller's Crossing. If it is in that register, it exists independent of anything Vera wants or does not want." He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving distance between them. "We send the letter to Thaddeus Mercer from Miller's Crossing, not from anywhere near Redstone Creek, and we go to the county register ourselves and we see what's there." "You're not afraid of this," she said. "I'm cautious of it. There is a difference. Being afraid means you spend your energy trying to avoid the thing. Being cautious means you spend your energy preparing to meet it." She almost smiled. "That's a useful distinction. It's kept me upright this long." She looked at her hands. The tremor had slowed. Then the gate at the end of the track opened. She saw Holt before she heard him because he had come on foot, no horse, no sound of approach to announce him before he was already there. He walked up the track with his hands visible at his sides and his hat pushed back in a way that made him look younger, like a man trying to project harmlessness and not quite landing the presentation. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Holt said. "You're here," Elijah said. "That's already a decision." Holt looked at Clara. There was something in his face she had cataloged carefully over 2 years. The quality that lived just below the surface of his consideration for her, the soft voice, the careful hands, the way he positioned himself as the reasonable one in a family of unreasonable people. On a different woman in a different life, it might have passed as genuine feeling. On Clara, after 2 years of education, in the gap between what people showed and what they meant, it read as ownership wearing the clothing of affection. "I came to tell you something," he said, "because I thought you should know before it happens, rather than after." Clara waited. Judge Harkins signed a writ this morning. She did not let it show on her face. She had learned that from Vera, the value of a surface that stays still when the current underneath is moving hard. Holt continued. "The writ names you as the widow with obligations to the family, names Mr. Cole as having committed abduction. Ma's planning to come out here tomorrow with the paper and 2 men and the sheriff behind her. What is the writ based on, Clara asked. Claims of stolen property. Holt's jaw worked, and Ma's got a statement from Doc Aldridge saying Roy's death had circumstances that warranted further investigation. That you may have, he stopped. That I may have what, Holt? He did not finish the sentence. She looked at him steadily. Your brother fell off a drunk horse on a February night, she said. I found him in the mud. I ran for the neighbor. There was nothing to investigate because there was nothing irregular. Your mother knows that. Your mother has known exactly what killed Roy Langston for the 20 years she watched it happen before I ever arrived in this county. Holt looked at his boots. I know, he said. The words were quiet and cost him something. The admission sat between them heavy as the midday heat. Then why, she said. He had no answer for that either. He looked up eventually, and she saw in his face the misery of a man who has been aware for a long time that the wrong thing is being done and has kept that awareness entirely private while doing nothing public about it, which is its own species of cowardice. Perhaps the most common kind, and in certain ways the most damaging, because it wears the face of a bystander while functioning as a collaborator. Come back with me, he said, before tomorrow, before this gets worse and people get hurt. Come back and Ma drops the complaint, the writ goes away, and what, Holt? The silence was the rest of his answer. Your brother has been dead for nearly 2 years, she said. I mourned him the way a wife mourns. I kept his house and mended his shirts and stayed in his bed long after there was any reason to, because I had nowhere else to go. And now you want me to do it all over again with a different Langston name because that is how your family keeps its widow contained and its land clean and everything exactly as Vera needs it. His face cycled through several things quickly. Then it went still. You've got until morning, he said. After that, it's out of my hands. He turned and walked back down the track and through the gate without looking back, and Clara sat down on the porch step with her knees pressed together and the weight of what was coming pressing down from above. Elijah came and stood beside her. A long silence settled between them. Then he said, How bad is a Judge Harkins writ? She said Judge Harkins is Vera Langston's cousin by marriage. His mother and Vera's mother were sisters. He has been buying cattle from the Langston Ranch for 11 years at prices that only make sense if you understand that money and favors travel the same roads in this county. Elijah absorbed this. The law isn't neutral here, Clara said. The law is another one of Vera's tools. She has spent 30 years making herself necessary to the right people and frightening to the wrong ones. And she has been patient about it in the way most people are not patient about anything. Every judge, every man with a title, and a desk, she knows which ones owe her something and which ones are afraid of her, and she keeps both lists accurate and current. He was quiet. Then, there is one thing she cannot control. What? A document filed before she knew to prevent it. If your marriage certificate is in the county register at Miller's Crossing, it exists independent of anything she wants or does not want. Facts are the one thing that does not negotiate with anyone. We should go today. First light, he said. She went inside and sat at the table and did something she had not done in longer than she could precisely remember. She sat and did nothing. She let the quiet be there without filling it. It lasted about 10 minutes. Then she got up and started on the evening meal because some kinds of steadiness are built from the inside out, one ordinary thing at a time. The humor arrived that evening unplanned, and it was the first genuinely uncomplicated thing that had happened between them. She had set the skillet down, and Elijah had come in from the pasture, and they were sitting across from each other in the particular silence that had developed between them. Not unfamiliar anymore, not the silence of strangers, but not yet the kind that has deep roots when she said, How bad? He looked up. About what, Vera? The judge. All of it together. He considered this with the same seriousness he applied to most things. She is connected enough to make things slow and expensive. Not connected enough to make them disappear. Not once a document exists. She nodded. Then, how bad is this coffee? He looked at his cup. Considered that question with equal gravity. Pretty bad. On a scale, the scale runs from bad to considerably worse. This is well into the considerably worse range. Clara took another sip. Considered. I've had worse, she said, but not by much, and not recently. The corner of his mouth did the thing it sometimes did, the slight movement that was not quite a smile, but knew what a smile was and had not ruled it out. Then came a short exhale through his nose, quiet and entirely real, the sound a man makes when something has surprised him past his defenses and his body has responded before his expression caught up. It was brief. It was real. It was the first thing between them that was neither obligation nor circumstance, but simply two people finding something small and absurd at the end of a long day and being willing to notice it together. Clara set her cup down. She thought, there it is, still there underneath everything. The part that could notice that bad coffee was funny. The part that had not been taken. She went to bed early with the door left halfway open. Not because she fully trusted everything yet, but because the thread of lamplight from the main room felt like a connection to something she wasn't ready to cut, and fell asleep to the small sounds of the ranch settling into night. They rode out before full light, the geldings steady on the road to Miller's Crossing, with both of them aboard the morning air cool, and carrying the smell of sage and the particular freshness that comes before the heat establishes itself for the day. Clara's hands had settled on Elijah's waist somewhere around the 3rd mile, without her having consciously decided to put them there, and she had not moved them when the road smoothed out. Neither of them said anything about it. Miller's Crossing was a crossroads town smaller than Redstone Creek and considerably less interested in the complicated loyalties of the surrounding county. The county clerk's office sat low on the main street, wedged between a land office and a saddler's shop, with a hand-painted sign above the door that weather had rendered nearly illegible. Elijah tied the gelding at the rail. Clara turned to him. "Let me do this." He stopped, looked at her. Then he nodded and leaned back against the post with his arms crossed. She went in alone. The clerk was a round man with spectacles and ink-stained cuffs, who looked at her chopped hair and the faint shadow still visible on her left cheekbone and had the good sense to say nothing about either. She gave him the names, the date, the location. He went into the back room and she stood at the counter listening to drawers opening and pages turning and the slow, consequential movement of time when you are waiting for something that will determine what happens next. 5 minutes, 10, 15. He came back carrying a large bound register held with the care of someone who understood that the facts in their keeping were sometimes the target of considerable human effort to rearrange. Whitten Langston marriage, he said, setting the register on the counter and opening it to a marked page. Recorded on the 14th of June, 1874. Certificate filed with the county on the 21st of June, 1874. Clara's hands found the edge of the counter. It was there, right there in ink pressed into paper by a pen that had been doing its job faithfully for 2 years, entirely indifferent to what Vera Langston needed and what she had burned in her kitchen stove on a winter night. Then she saw something else. She leaned forward, and the clerk, who had already seen it, she realized who had probably seen it the moment he opened the page and had been waiting to see if she would notice, watched her without speaking. Along the line bearing her name and Roy Langston's name, there was a mark. A subtle disruption in the paper surface different from the regular aging of the page. A slight thinning, a faint roughness, the kind of thing you would only notice with close attention or at the right angle to the light. Someone had taken a blade to this page. A razor, most likely. They had attempted to remove the ink. They had not succeeded. The record was still clear and legible, but they had tried. She looked at the clerk. "When did this happen?" He pushed his spectacles up. "I noticed it 8 days ago during a routine review. It was not present when I last examined this section approximately 3 weeks prior." He paused. "I have noted the discovery in the office log along with the date. What you are seeing constitutes tampering with a government record." "That is a criminal offense." "Yes, ma'am." "It is." She straightened. "I would like 3 certified copies of this record." She reached for her small purse. "And I will purchase them with my own money." The coins she used were from selling eggs to a neighbor along the creek road, money she had earned herself in the days since she arrived, the first money that was purely hers in 2 years. It was not much. It was enough for what she needed right now, and enough was the right amount. The clerk made the copies with appropriate gravity. He stamped each one and signed his name in the careful hand of a man who understood the weight of what he was certifying. She walked outside into the morning light and held the 3 folded papers up. Elijah straightened from the post. He read the look on her face. And then for the first time since she had known him, for the first time in what she suspected was a genuinely long time, he smiled. Not the careful, controlled shift at the corner of his mouth she had seen before. A real smile, full and unguarded, starting in the eyes and moving outward, and changing the entire shape of his face and making him look younger than she had imagined he could look. "She can't touch you now," he said. She looked at the papers in her hand. She almost said she can try. She almost said this isn't over yet. She almost said a dozen accurate and cautious things. Instead, she said, "She can't touch us." The word fell between them, and she felt it land. She did not take it back. He heard it, and she saw the quality of stillness that came over him. Not the careful, protective stillness of a man guarding something fragile, but the stillness of someone receiving something unexpected and taking a moment to understand what it is. "Let's go home," he said. She looked at him. "Home." He said it the way you say a word when it belongs to more than one person. The smoke was visible from 3 miles out. Not the thin, pale thread of a stovepipe, but something heavier and darker, rising in a column that bent south with the afternoon wind and dispersed against the pale sky in a way that said deliberate rather than accidental, that said someone rather than something. She felt Elijah's body change before he spoke. The settled ease of a man comfortable on his own land went out of him, and what replaced it was alert and already moving. He kicked the gelding into a run. They came over the ridge at full gallop. The chicken coop was burning flames, eating through the dry boards with the specific efficiency of fire that has been helped along. Hens scattered through the yard in every direction. Smoke poured up in a column that smelled of char and straw, and something underneath that was worse. Elijah was off the gelding before it stopped grabbing buckets from the porch. Clara was behind him, hauling the second bucket from the pump trough, and they threw water until the flames hissed and spat and finally choked, and what remained was a blackened frame and twisted wire and the smell of destruction hanging over the yard. 3 hens lay still inside. The rest milled in confusion. Clara stood in the ash with her dress soaked to the knee and her hands black. She breathed the smell of it in and out and felt something moving through her that was cold and clear and more useful than either panic or despair. Then she saw the paper. Nailed to the fence post near the gate edges, blackened by heat, but the words still readable written in a hand she would have recognized anywhere, the same tight, deliberate script that had appeared at the top of every list of tasks she had ever been handed. 2 words: "Come home." Elijah took the paper from her hand. "Read it." His body did what iron does when it moves from warmth to cold. Something hardened and settled in a new and permanent position. "She thinks this will frighten me back," Clara said. "Will it?" She turned to face him. Her voice came out dry and level. The voice of a woman who had been frightened so many times and in so many different ways that she had begun to understand fear not as something that controlled her, but as information data about what someone else needed her to feel. "Elijah, I survived 2 years in that house. I survived having my hair cut off in front of this town. I survived riding into Redstone Creek alone in the dark because it was the necessary thing to do. I am not frightened of a burned chicken coop." He held the paper. "What are you frightened of?" She was quiet for a moment. The real answer deserved consideration. "Wasting it," she said, "getting through all of this, and then wasting what comes after because I don't know what to do with it. Because I've spent so long surviving that I've forgotten what it looks like to simply live." He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "We rebuild the coop tomorrow. We file the counterclaim with Mercer's help before the week is done." She looked at him. "And the other part, the living part." He picked up the empty bucket. "That part," he said, "I expect we figure out as we go." They cleaned the yard together in the late afternoon heat and banked the pump and put the surviving hens in the barn for the night. The letter from Thaddeus Mercer arrived 4 days after they filed Clara's formal statement with Sheriff Calloway at Miller's Crossing, sent by way of a boy on a thin mare who handed it over the fence without dismounting. Clara took it and stood in the yard with the afternoon sun pressing on the back of her neck and read it once, then again, then a third time because the words kept arranging themselves in ways she needed to verify. "He says I have a claim," she said when Elijah came from the east fence with the wire cutters. Her voice was thin. "Under territorial law, a widow without children is entitled to 1/3 of her husband's property at the time of death. The Langston family has been in violation of that statute since the day Roy died." Elijah was quiet. "Nearly 2 years of labor," she continued. "Nearly 2 years of withholding what was legally mine. He says there is a figure." She told him the figure. He took his hat off and moved his hand through his hair. He also says, she continued, that Vera's attempt to void the marriage has no legal standing as long as the county register shows the certificate. And the county register shows the certificate. And someone tried to remove it from the record. Mercer says that evidence of tampering, combined with the certified copies in the clerk's log entry, strengthens my position. It establishes a pattern of deliberate interference with her legal rights. She folded the letter in both hands. What do you want to do? Elijah asked. I want to file the claim. Then we file it. It will cost money. Mercer wants a retainer. She told him the amount. He nodded once. He walked inside and came back with a small metal box she had never seen before. Dull and plain, the kind of box used for things that matter more than they look. He opened it on the porch rail. Inside were bills, worn and creased, the money of a man who had been saving from the edges of a quiet life for a long time. He counted out the amount and held it out. No, Clara said. He looked at her. Absolutely not. She kept her voice level but firm. That is 8 years of savings from a man who has been living alone on this ranch and spending almost nothing. I am not taking your savings. It's not charity. It's a choice. It's my fight, Elijah. He held the money without lowering it. His voice had the patience of a fence post, not demanding anything, simply not moving. I have a cabin, a horse, 40 head of cattle, and enough land to keep me occupied until I die, he said. I do not need this money to be comfortable. You need it to be free. Those two things are not the same thing. She stared at him. He said Margaret once argued with a mule for 20 minutes about whether to cross a shallow creek. The mule was wrong. She was right. She crossed first and the mule followed. He paused. You can be the mule or you can be Margaret. Either way, the creek gets crossed. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The money was still in his hand, steady as the man holding it. She would have liked you, she said quietly. Something moved behind his eyes and settled. That's what I'm counting on, he said. She took the money. That evening, she wrote to Thaddeus Mercer in Abilene, instructing him to file the formal property claim and enclosing the retainer. She sealed it with her own hand and set it on the table for morning. Somewhere across 7 miles of Texas scrubland, in the kitchen where Clara had spent 2 years being made smaller, Vera Langston received the news that the county register still existed, that the copies had been made, and certified that the woman she had tried to erase had the tools she needed to fight. Vera did not shout. She did not break anything. She sat with her hands flat on the table in the dark kitchen for a long time, and when she had finished thinking, she opened a different drawer and took out a different document, one that had nothing to do with marriage records or property rights or anything she had tried so far. She had spent 30 years building things. She was not finished. But what she could not know sitting in that kitchen was that the woman she had tried to erase was sitting 7 miles away at a table with a lamp burning above her, writing with a steady hand and the particular quiet confidence of someone who has found after a long time of having nothing solid underfoot a piece of ground that holds. Clara finished the letter. Read it once. Every word held up. She folded it, set it with the retainer, blew out the lamp. She made herself a promise in the dark. She was not going to wait for tomorrow to find her. She was going to go out and meet it. The decision arrived not as a thought she worked her way toward through careful reasoning, but as a fact she discovered was already true, the way you discover the particular stone underfoot when you take a step and feel it their solid, certain place long before you arrived at this moment. She was going to ride into Redstone Creek tonight, not tomorrow when Vera would come with her paper and her sons and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has arranged events to confirm her superiority. Not in the morning when Vera's narrative would already be established and Clara would be responding to it from an inferior position. Tonight when the town was quiet and the conversations of tomorrow had not yet been rehearsed and the shape of things was still soft enough to be influenced. She told Elijah at supper. He set his fork down and looked at her with the careful expression of a man choosing between what he wanted to say and what he understood he did not have the standing to say. You'll go alone, he said. It was not a question. If you ride in with me, she said, you hand Vera precisely what she needs. She has already told this county that you took me. You arriving in town at night with a rifle on your saddle is not a defense. It is a demonstration of exactly what she has been saying. He was quiet. I know what I'm doing, she said. I know Calloway is fair. I know he is not her man. He is the law's man, and the law does not like being used as someone's personal instrument, not indefinitely, not by anyone. If I can sit across from him tonight, and tell him everything before she fills his ears with her version, I have a real chance of shaping what tomorrow looks like. Elijah looked at the table. His jaw worked. I am not asking for permission, she said. I know you're not. Then what? He reached behind the stove without looking and set a small object on the table between them. A derringer, old and clean, with a pearl handle worn smooth by long handling, small enough to fit in a skirt pocket. It was Margaret's, he said. She never had occasion to use it. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man looking at something that carries more history than its size suggests. I hope you don't either. Clara picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. The pearl handle was warm from being stored near the stove, or perhaps from being kept close for 14 years by a man who couldn't keep the woman it had belonged to. I'll bring it back, she said. He looked at her steadily. Bring yourself back. That is what matters. She rode out at dusk on the gelding, who moved down the road with the confident patience of an animal who knows every stone of the way and has no complaints about the hour. The western sky held its strip of deep amber above the ridge. The first stars were appearing in the east. The air smelled of calm and the particular clean emptiness that Texas acquires at the end of a long, hot day when the heat finally begins to release what it has been holding. She did not look back at the cabin. She knew without looking that Elijah was on the porch with the lamp behind him and his hands at his sides, watching her go. In the way he watched things he knew he needed to let happen without interfering. If she looked back, she might stop going. So she kept her eyes on the road ahead. An hour and a half later, Redstone Creek appeared as a scatter of yellow window light in the dark, small and domestic, and entirely unaware that anything consequential was approaching. She rode around to the back of the livery and tied the gelding where he would not be seen from the main street, and she walked through the back lanes to the sheriff's office with the derringer in her skirt pocket and her hands steady at her sides. The light was on inside. She knocked. Calloway looked up from his newspaper, his boots on the desk, his expression moving through surprise, and then something more careful and attentive. He swung his feet down and stood. Mrs. Whitten, come in and close the door. She sat in the chair across his desk and she told him everything. Not the summary, not the version that covered the legal essentials. The full version from the beginning. A woman signing a mail-order contract in a boarding house in Tennessee because she had nothing left and nowhere to go. 8 months of marriage to a man whose drinking had been established long before her arrival, nearly 2 years of what followed after his death. She told him about the food withheld and the wages never paid and the first time the shears appeared in the kitchen 6 months ago. She told him about Holt's proposal and what it actually was beneath the careful presentation. She told him about the letter to Thaddeus Mercer and what it had cost her. She told him about the county register and the razor marks in the paper and what that meant about how far someone was willing to go. She told him about Roy, the mud and the dark and running for the neighbor, and the words Vera had delivered in the doorway after, and 20 years of a man's choices that had nothing to do with Clara and everything to do with the man himself and the family that had decided she was a more useful explanation than the truth. Calloway listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened a desk drawer, produced a bottle and 2 glasses and pushed one toward her. I'm not much of a drinking woman, Sheriff. Tonight he said you might want to reconsider. She picked up the glass and took a careful sip. It burned going down and settled something on the way. Here is what I know, Calloway said. He leaned back with the manner of a man who has been thinking about this longer than tonight. Judge Harkins signed that writ because Vera Langston has spent the past week occupying his office, and Harkins is a man who would rather sign something and have it leave than not sign it and have it remain on his desk. He is lazy, not corrupt. The distinction matters. He picked up his own glass. A recorded statement from a widow made freely in the presence of a law officer, documented in an official notebook, carries more weight than a writ signed under that kind of pressure. If you are at that gate tomorrow morning and you tell me in front of witnesses that you are there by your own choosing, I can put that in the record. And once it is in the record, the writ has nothing substantial left to stand on. Clara looked at him. And if Vera brings her sons onto the property? Calloway set his glass down. If Vera Langston brings her sons onto Elijah Cole's property with the intent to remove you by force, that ceases to be a family matter. That is assault, and I will arrest every person who participates in it. He paused, including the woman who organized it. Something in Clara's chest released not all at once, but the way a rope releases when the tension that has held it taut for too long finally lets go and you feel it through your whole body. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow is going to be unpleasant, regardless of how it resolves. He walked her to the door. One more thing. That man of yours, Cole, is he reliable with a rifle? He is not my man, she said. Calloway gave her the look of a man who had been in the business of observing people long enough to recognize the difference between what they said and what was plainly evident. Just make sure he does not shoot anyone before I arrive. She rode back through the full dark, the gelding choosing his own path along the road with the unhurried certainty of an animal who trusts the ground. The sky above was dense with stars, more than she had allowed herself to look at in years, because looking at beautiful things when you are miserable is its own kind of additional pain. She looked at them now without any of the old prohibition. The cabin light appeared on the horizon like a lamp set in a window by someone who intended it to be seen from a long way off. Elijah was on the porch when she came into the yard. He stood when he heard the gelding, and she watched his shoulders drop by a fraction, the precise release of a man who has been holding something tightly for 2 hours and has just been told he can let it go. What did he say, he asked, before she was off the horse. She told him everything. Calloway's plan, the recorded statement, the formal threat of arrest if the Langstons attempted force. Elijah was quiet for a moment. You did that, he said. Rode in alone after dark, sat across from the sheriff, put the whole case on his desk. I did. He shook his head slowly. In the lamplight, his face was open in a way she had not seen before, not admiration, which was too simple a word for it, but something more like recognition. The expression of a man seeing someone clearly for the first time and understanding that what he sees is larger than what he had expected. Clara May Whitten, he said quietly. Elijah Cole, she said. You scare me a little. Good, he said. Morning came hot and still. Clara was dressed and on the porch before the sun cleared the ridge, her hair brushed as smooth as its short, uneven length allowed. She wore her clean dress and Elijah's flannel shirt over it, unbuttoned, because it smelled like cedar, and the soap he used in the specific quality of this place, and she wanted to go into whatever was coming, wrapped in something that had become hers. Elijah stood at the fence in his blue work shirt beneath the brown leather vest, both worn soft with labor and weather. He had shaved that morning, and without the stubble, the lines of his face were cleaner and more open, the face of a man who had decided to be visible today. The rifle leaned against the fence post beside him, within easy reach, not in his hands. They saw the dust at 8:30. 2 columns, one from the south, which was Calloway, one from the east, which was Vera. Cole, Snow, Mrs. Whitten. Fine morning for unpleasantness. The Lankeston party came 5 minutes later. Vera on the wagon seat, rigid and composed, a folded paper in both hands. Holt rode a roan horse beside the wagon, his face carefully empty. Behind them came Wade on a gray, his jaw set, his eyes moving across the property with the calculating look of a man assessing rather than arriving. 2 hired men followed behind, sitting their horses with the watchful patience of men being paid to be present. They stopped at the gate. Vera stood in the wagon bed, and her voice carried across the yard with the precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime making herself heard. Sheriff Calloway, I have a writ signed by Judge Harkins ordering the return of my son's widow and the arrest of the man who took her. I've seen the writ, Mrs. Langston, Calloway said without adjusting his expression or his tone. I've also spoken with Mrs. Whitten. She tells me she left your household of her own choosing. She is lying. Half this town watched your family cut her hair and cover her face with axle grease in a public alley, Calloway said, in the measured tone of a man stating something so obvious that he would prefer not to have to state it. You want to discuss the subject of lying, that is a conversation we can have. But I would think carefully about where it leads. Vera's mouth compressed into a thin white line. I have a legal document, and I am the law in this county, Calloway said, not Judge Harkins. He turned to Clara. Mrs. Whitten, for the record, are you present at this property of your own choosing? Clara stepped forward. She had been holding these words in her mind since the night before, not memorizing them, because they didn't need to be memorized, but letting them settle into a shape that was entirely and irrevocably hers. Yes, sir, she said. I am here because I chose to be here. I was not taken and I was not deceived. I left the Langston household because I was held there without wages for nearly 2 years, fed last in a house I maintained, with my own labor and publicly humiliated in front of witnesses in the middle of this town. I am a widow and a free woman under the law of this territory, and I am not going back. Calloway wrote it down. The sound of his pencil was the loudest thing in the yard. He closed his notebook. Witnessed by Deputy Aldous Prentice and all parties present, date and time recorded. He looked up. Miss Langston, this statement supersedes the writ. If you have a property claim, file it with the territorial court in Abilene, this woman stays where she is. Wade swung off his horse. This is not how this ends, Calloway. Mr. Langston, get back on your horse. You're going to let this man keep our brother's wife because of a few words she said in front of you. She is your brother's widow, Calloway said, and his voice did not rise a single note, which made it more authoritative than shouting. She has told you to your face that she does not want to go with you. Get back on your horse, or I will put you on it. Wade looked at Holt. Holt looked at his mother. Vera's face had gone through white and red and arrived at something beyond both a compressed banked quality, like a fire that has been covered but not put out, that is waiting for the next opportunity to find air. This is not finished, Vera said. That may be, Calloway said, but today it is. Ride home, Mrs. Langston. The silence that followed had physical weight. No one moved. The horses shifted. From behind the barn, the windmill turned its slow half-circle in the morning air. Somewhere above the ridge, a hawk called once and was quiet. Then Holt reached over and put his hand on his mother's arm, and this time she did not shake him off. She sat down, not because she had been persuaded, and not because she had given up the rigid line of her back, and the way she held the writ made clear she was already thinking about what she would do next. But she sat down. The wagon turned. The wheels ground in the dirt. Wade mounted up with his face hard and dark and followed. The hired men turned their horses without being told. The column moved back toward the road and the dust rose behind it. Clara watched them go. She watched until the last of the dust settled and the road was empty in both directions, and the only sounds were the cattle somewhere in the far pasture and the small, ordinary sounds of a morning conducting its business. Then she sat down on the porch step, put her face in her hands, and wept. Not from sadness, not from fear, from something that did not yet have a name, the raw shaking release of a woman who had stood in front of the people who had broken her and said no with her full voice and had it hold. The strange, exhausting grief of returning to yourself after a long absence, the weight of being permitted to exist. Elijah sat down beside her, not touching, not speaking, simply there steady as the boards under them, patient with the particular patience of a man who understands that some things must move at their own speed and that trying to hurry them is to damage them. After a while, she lifted her head and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I got your neckerchief dirty again, she said. Her voice was rough and broken, and something underneath it was trying to be a laugh. I've got another one. She looked at him. His face was calm, but his eyes, those dark, quiet eyes that had seen Shiloh and an empty house and 14 years of a specific kind of solitude, his eyes were full. Thank you for not shooting anybody, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was harder than you think. She laughed. It came out wet and real and arrived before she could decide about it, the kind that starts somewhere you had forgotten you owned. He watched her laugh the way a man watches rain after a drought he has stopped expecting to end. Calloway tipped his hat from the road. I'll be in touch if anything changes. Keep your heads down and stay out of trouble. She called after him. Sheriff, you said Vera annoys you. Was that the truth? Calloway pulled up and considered this with visible seriousness. Ma'am, I have been shot at by men who meant it, kicked by mules on 3 separate occasions, and bitten by a rattlesnake that had gotten into my boot. He paused. Vera Langston is worse than all 3 combined because she does not stop. He rode out, and the morning took him. The letter from Thaddeus Mercer arrived on a Thursday. The news it contained was as good. Then 3 days later, a second communication arrived, and that news was not. A clerk from the territorial court in Austin came up the road on a borrowed horse with a leather case under his arm and the expression of a man who had drawn the short end of an assignment. He served notice at the gate. Clara took the papers and read them standing. Vera had filed a counterclaim with the territorial court, asserting that the marriage between Clara Whitten and Roy Langston had never been properly recorded. No valid marriage meant no legal widow. No legal widow meant no property rights, no claim, no standing, no protection. She is trying to erase me, Clara said. Not simply take my property. Make it so I was never here, never married, never real. Elijah read the papers over her shoulder. His jaw flexed once and was still. The county register, he said. She already tried to tamper with it. She failed, but she tried. Clara folded the papers with precise, controlled movements. This was the real objective all along. The writ, the confrontation, all of it, that was to keep us occupied while she moved this piece. She does not improvise. She builds. And she has been building this since before the alley. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the certified copies you already have. In the cabin. 3 copies stamped, signed, witnessed. The clerk's log entry documenting the tampering. The copies predate her counterclaim. She filed knowing the record exists, hoping you don't have the means to prove it. Clara turned this over carefully. Mercer can respond to the territorial court, she said slowly. The certified copies plus the tampering evidence. She tried to destroy the record and failed. And then she tried to pretend it doesn't exist and we can establish both things. He nodded. She looked at the papers in her hand. She thinks I have nothing. You have everything, he said. You've had it since Miller's Crossing. They wrote to Mercer that evening and laid out everything with the care of 2 people who understood that every word needed to carry the full weight of what they were asking it to carry. Clara wrote, and Elijah listened, and when she finished reading it aloud, he said, "It holds. Every line of it holds." Mercer's response came within 10 days. The certified copies combined with the documented evidence of tampering had been sufficient for the presiding judge to dismiss Vera's counterclaim pending review. The tampering evidence had triggered a separate inquiry into deliberate interference with public records. The marriage was legal. The claim was proceeding. Vera Langston was running out of road. Mercer came in person on a Saturday, arriving in a wagon with his leather case and his spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He was perhaps 30, with the organized, precise manner of a man whose mind expressed itself in the arrangement of his work. He sat at the kitchen table and laid out where things stood. The property claim will hold, he said. 1/3 of Roy Langston's assets at time of death. The counterclaim is effectively finished. The tampering inquiry is ongoing. He pushed his spectacles up. There is one additional development. Vera Langston contacted me 4 days ago. She wishes to settle. Clara went still. The terms, the full 1/3 share fair market value paid within 60 days. In exchange, you sign a release and agree to no further contact with the family. He paused. There is one additional condition. What condition? Mercer set a paper on the table and turned it toward her. Clara read the condition at the bottom of the page in careful legal language that almost concealed what it was actually pointing at, but she read it and understood it the way you understand a trap, by what it is aimed at rather than by its mechanism. The additional condition required Clara to sign a statement acknowledging that Elijah Cole had exercised undue influence over her decisions since the 14th of June. She read it twice. Then she looked up. This would revive the charges against him, she said. The original case from 8 years ago. If I sign a statement that he influenced me, it gives Vera grounds to reopen that case in the county courts. Mercer nodded carefully. She is not offering me a settlement, Clara said. She is offering to buy my freedom by selling his. She has never wanted money. She has always wanted him gone, because he is the one person in this county who knows something she cannot afford to have examined. Mercer's expression was the expression of a lawyer who had arrived at the same understanding several days ago and had been waiting for his client to find it herself. Clara picked up the paper. She folded it once precisely along the center. Then she tore it in half. No settlement, she said. We go to court. Mercer looked at the 2 halves on the table. A slight nod, the barely perceptible nod of a man who has been doing this work long enough to recognize when a client has found the right answer by themselves. Then I need one more thing, he said, and it will not be easily obtained. A written confession from Vera Langston herself. Her own hand, her own words acknowledging specifically what she did and what she withheld. Without it, we can win the property claim. The evidence is sufficient. But with it, we establish a pattern of deliberate, systematic harm that protects you permanently from any future action the family might attempt. Clara considered this. She will never willingly sign that. Mercer looked at her steadily. In my 8 years of practice, people sign things they would never voluntarily sign when they understand that the alternative is considerably worse. Let me present the full scope of what we have, the tampering evidence, the labor claim, the inquiry, and let her calculate her options. He left in the early afternoon. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go. She will try one more thing before she signs anything, Clara said quietly. She always has one more thing. Elijah stood beside her and let her try on. The second thing Vera tried was to send Reverend Hatch, of all people, Reverend Hatch, who came to the gate with his hat in his hands and could not quite find Clara's eyes, to say that Vera was prepared to discuss terms privately without the lawyer. Clara did not go. The third thing was an unsigned letter in familiar handwriting, suggesting that if the property claim was dropped and Clara agreed to leave the county, Vera would arrange for the record tampering inquiry to be quietly discontinued. Clara gave the letter to Mercer, and then on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after Mercer's visit, a boy came up the road from Miller's Crossing with an envelope, and inside the envelope was a single page in Vera Langston's tight, deliberate hand. Clara read it at the kitchen table with the lamp burning above her and Elijah sitting across from her. She read it once in silence, then again. Then she set it down and said, "Read it." He picked it up. The letter began as she had required, the acknowledgments, the dates, the specific acts. The hair, the paste and ash on her face, the nearly 2 years without wages, the confinement. The words were Vera's, pressed hard into the paper with the force of a woman writing what she has been compelled to write. And they were all there. And then there was more. Below the required admissions, in the same tight hand, but with a different quality to the pen, slightly less controlled, pressing harder in some places and barely touching the paper in others, the writing of a woman who had been sitting at this task for a long time and whose control was beginning to show its limits. There were 3 additional sentences. Elijah read them. His face did not change, but she watched his hands. He set the letter down, looked at it for a long moment, picked it up and read those 3 sentences again. Then he set it down again. The 3 sentences said that in the matter of the death of a man named Garrett Pruitt in Redstone Creek in the year 1868, the statement Vera Langston gave to the county magistrate had not been accurate. That the person responsible for Garrett Pruitt's death was not Elijah Cole. That the person responsible was her son, Wade Langston, and that she had known this since the night it occurred. 8 years. 8 years of a town that would not look at him directly, of eyes sliding away when he passed on the street, of space opening around him, not because anyone was afraid of him, but because they had made a collective decision about who he was and maintained that decision through daily discipline over 8 years. 8 years of a man building a life at the very edges of other people's certainties, alone on a creek road 7 miles from town, talking to a horse because there was no one else to talk to. And all of it, every one of those 8 years, built on 3 false sentences from a woman who had needed someone to stand between her son and what her son had done. Elijah sat very still. Clara did not speak. She did not move toward him or away from him. She simply remained present the way he had been present for her, not managing the space, not filling it with words, not trying to help in any active sense, just there, solid and real and not going anywhere. After a long time, he looked up. She had never seen his face quite like this. Not broken, that was not in the architecture of him, she understood that now, but open. The particular openness of a face that has been holding something in a sealed place for a very long time, and when the place is finally opened, the air that comes out carries the temperature of a long time ago. She reached across the table and covered his hand with both of hers. He did not speak. She did not ask him to. The next morning, he rode to Miller's Crossing with the letter and gave it to Mercer. Mercer rode to Calloway. Calloway read the 3 sentences and was quiet for a long time and then said, "I'll need to speak to the town council." Elijah said, "I know." For the first time in 8 years, that was all he needed to say. The flashback came to him that night, not as sleep, but as memory arriving with the clarity of things the mind has processed enough times to finally be able to hold without flinching. He had come back from the war in the spring of 1865. He had known riding up that road that something was wrong before he reached the house, and not from any specific sign, just from the quality of the silence around the place, the particular stillness of a house that has stopped being inhabited from the inside. He had known it in the way that soldiers returning from wars sometimes know things because they have become practiced at reading the space around structures for what is absent. Their clothes were still on the pegs. The cradle he had built with his own hands, the small crib with the carved posts he had worked on in the evenings, the winter before he left, wanting it finished and ready, was standing in the corner of the room. Empty, clean, waiting for a child who had been 3 years old the last time he had held her and would never before. He had sat in that room for a long time. He did not know how long. Then he had gotten up and gone to the hill behind the barn where the two crosses stood, and he had stood in front of them until it got dark and then stood there some more. He had come to Redstone Creek 3 years later in 1868, looking for nothing more particular than a place to do work and keep to himself. What he had found instead was a dead man, a panicked town, a woman named Vera Langston, who understood that a stranger with no allies and no local standing is the most useful kind of person to have available when a crime needs an author. He had not known until this Wednesday night that it was her son's hands that had done it. He had lived with not knowing that for 8 years. He put the letter down on the table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed in and breathed out until the thing in his chest settled to something he could carry. In the morning, he would ride to Miller's Crossing. In the morning, he would begin the process of the town understanding what had actually happened in 1868. In the morning, there would be steps to take and things to do. Tonight, he sat with what the last 8 years had actually been, knowing it clearly for the first time, and he let it be what it was. The settlement papers arrived 3 weeks after Mercer delivered Vera's letter to the authorities. Mercer came in person carrying a leather case and the bank draft in a sealed envelope. He sat at the kitchen table and walked through the documents with the organized precision that was his natural condition, while Elijah stood in the doorway. The property claim had been settled at the full one-third value. The record tampering inquiry had resulted in a formal censure of the Langston family and a referral of Wade Langston's involvement in the 1868 death to the county prosecutor. The counterclaim attempting to void the marriage had been dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be raised again. Clara signed the papers with the pen held the way her father had taught her, firmly from the shoulder, and her signature was clear and large and entirely legible. The bank draft was not a fortune, but it was hers, earned through the simple, hard, necessary act of insisting on her own existence until the law finally agreed with her. She held it for a moment, then she put it in her pocket. Mercer shook her hand. "Mrs. Whitten, it has been an education." "Mr. Mercer," she said, "it has been a fight." He smiled. "The best ones usually are." He climbed back into his wagon and was gone, and Clara stood in the yard and watched him go. Elijah came down from the porch and stood in front of her. She looked at him and saw something in his face she had not seen there before. A nervousness, a careful uncertainty. The expression of a man who has decided to say something and has not yet committed to the exact words. What she said? Nothing. "Elijah Cole," she said, "you have been looking at me like a man trying to swallow something that won't go down for the better part of 20 minutes. What is it?" He pushed off the rail and stood straight. He took his hat off, turned it twice in his hands, a habit she had come to recognize as the physical expression of a man organizing his thoughts, and then reached into his shirt pocket. He set a small wooden box on the porch rail between them. Rough cut, plain, the lid fitting snug. "I have something for you," he said, "if it is all right." She opened it. Inside, resting on a folded scrap of clean cotton, was a hair comb. Silver, the metal tarnished in the creases and at the joints, the pattern along its spine, a row of small vines and blossoms worn soft by years of handling. Not new, not perfect. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been made with care and held with love and kept with grief, the beauty of things that have meant something to someone for a long time. He said it was Margaret's. She wore it on the day we were married. "I put it in that box the week she died, and it has been there since." He swallowed. "I want you to have it." He stopped. Then, "Your hair is growing back, and I thought you should have something given to you because someone wanted to give it. Not because they owed you anything. Not because they were afraid of what happened if they didn't. Simply because they wanted to." Clara held the comb in her palm. The silver was warm. She could feel the years in it, the love that had given it, the grief that had placed it in the box and kept it close for 14 years. Because the man who kept it could not bring himself to put it further away than that. "Elijah," she said, "this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. It's just a comb." No, she said. It is not. It is trust. You are giving me something that belonged to the woman you loved most in the world, and you are telling me that I am worth carrying it forward. He could not speak. She saw it the way his jaw locked and his throat moved and his eyes went full and bright. This man who had come back from a war to an empty house, who had built a life out of silence and steady work in the daily refusal to stop going, who had walked into an alley one Tuesday morning because he was close enough and could not walk away from what he was seeing. She slid the comb into her hair. It caught and held. "How does it look?" she said. "Like it was always yours." She stepped forward and placed her hands flat on his chest. He went still the way he always did when she touched him, as if movement might disturb whatever had brought her this close, as if the right thing was to be completely steady until she decided what she wanted to do next. "Elijah," she said, "I have an answer for the question you asked me. When all of this is done, the lawyers and the courts and Vera and all of it, what then?" He looked at her. "Then I stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because you saved me, or I owe you something, or I am afraid of being alone. I stay because you asked me what I wanted, and no one had asked me that in so long that I had almost forgotten the answer existed in me somewhere. I stay because you gave me the room to find out who I am when nobody is trying to make me smaller. I stay because when I plant something in that garden, I want to be here to see it grow." She looked at him directly. "And I stay because I love you, Elijah Cole, and I am done being afraid of saying that out loud." He was quiet long enough that the silence had a shape and a weight. Then his hands came up slow and deliberate and framed her face. His thumbs traced the line of her jaw, the same jaw where Holt's greased dark fingers had once turned her face toward a crowd so they could see what had been done to her. He held her face the way you hold something that has been broken and repaired, with full knowledge of where the mend is and complete respect for the strength of it. "I love you, Clara May Witten," he said. "I have loved you since the day you told me my cooking was terrible, and you were right." She laughed, real and immediate and entirely surprised. "It was terrible," she said. "I know." He kissed her the way he did everything slowly with his full attention, with the steady patience of a man who has learned that the things worth having do not come from hurrying and do not ask you to. She kissed him back, and in it was every mile of road between who she had been and who she was standing there in the afternoon light. The wedding was on a Saturday, under the cottonwood tree beside the creek at the south edge of the property, where the bank was soft and the grass grew green because the water kept it through the summer heat. The cottonwood cast its wide, quiet shade across the ground, and the water moved past with the small sound it makes when it has nowhere urgent to go. Reverend Hatch came from Redstone Creek. Before the ceremony, he took Clara's hands in both of his and looked at her directly for the first time in all the months she had known him. "I should have spoken in that alley," he said. "When I watched what was being done and I stood there and kept my silence, I told myself a story about it afterward that I stopped believing some time ago. This is the least I can do." She looked at him. She did not say it was all right because it had not been all right and he needed to carry some of what he had not done for a while longer still. But she nodded and his hands relaxed and they walked together to the creek. Sheriff Calloway was there, his badge polished to the kind of brightness that indicates deliberate morning effort, his mustache trimmed for the occasion. Old Clem arrived on a borrowed horse 45 minutes before the ceremony began, having ridden 12 miles from before dawn, carrying a jar of honey from his own hives wrapped in a clean cloth. He tied his horse at the fence and came to stand in the front without being asked, and did not say much, which was exactly right, because the occasion did not need his words, only his presence. Clara wore her clean dress and the flannel shirt over it unbuttoned, because the flannel shirt was the first thing Elijah had given her that had no terms attached to it, and no expectations and no debt, pure comfort offered simply, and she wanted to be married in it. She had brushed her hair that morning until it was as smooth as its short, uneven, growing back length would allow. At the back, where the longest pieces had grown past her ears, she had tried to pin it and found it would not stay. The silver comb held it. Elijah stood beside her under the cottonwood in his blue work shirt and the brown leather vest, both worn to the color of things that had been used for the right purposes for a long time. He held his hat in his hands. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the expression of a man who has not expected something and is still adjusting to the reality of it being true. Reverend Hatch opened his book. "Do you take this woman?" Elijah said. "I've been taking her side since the day I met her." "Reckon I'll keep at it," old Clem, standing in the front row, said quietly to no one in particular. "Shortest vow I have ever heard." Calloway beside him, equally quiet. "Probably the most honest one I have witnessed." Reverend Hatch looked at the two of them. He smiled. He pronounced them married with the expression of a man making a small, insufficient, but genuine reparation for a larger wrong he had committed through inaction and finding that it was not nothing. That night, Clara sat at the table by lamplight and wrote a letter. 4 sentences. They were already complete when she sat down. They had been complete for some time, waiting only for the right moment to be committed to paper. "Mrs. Langston, I am writing to inform you that I have married Elijah Cole. I am well. I am standing on my own ground. I will not be writing again." She folded it, sealed it, set it aside for the morning. It was not forgiveness. She was not there, and she did not pretend otherwise. It was something different, the closing of a door done from the inside by her own hand at the time she chose. Not a bridge, not an invitation, not an opening of any kind. A door latched firmly, the latch on her side of it. Elijah would ride it to Miller's Crossing in the morning, and it would go from there, and she would never receive a reply, and she did not expect one. The letter was not for Vera's benefit. It was for hers. Autumn came to the ranch the way autumn comes to that part of Texas, not dramatically, not with the sharp turn of more northern places, but slowly in small signs, the angle of the morning light shifting, the sage going silver at the tips, the air carrying something in the evenings that was not quite cool but was a promise of cool. The beans had climbed their poles past the height Clara had expected, and the squash lay heavy and golden on the vines, and the corn had grown taller than her head. And in the mornings when the light came across it sideways, it made the sound of something living and quiet going about its own business. She had learned to ride the gelding properly alone in front, her skirts hiked and her short hair lifting in the wind, and her hands loose on the reins, the way Elijah had shown her, learning that the horse responded better to ease than to grip, which she suspected was true of most things. Elijah had taught her to shoot. She had proven to be, as he put it, with characteristic understatement, an apt student. She did not mention that she had been practicing in her mind for years with various imagined targets. One evening at the end of a long, warm day, as the heat was finally beginning to think about releasing its hold, and the first breath of autumn moved through the sage, Clara sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil. Not a letter, not a document, a list. Things I want to do, things I was told I could not do, things I was afraid to want. Elijah came in from the pasture and stood behind her and looked at the paper over her shoulder. "Read it to me," he said. She read, "Learn to shoot properly, already done. Read every book in the Miller's Crossing lending library. Teach someone else to read. Build a proper chicken coop from good lumber, built right. Grow something that flowers for no reason except that it's beautiful. See the ocean." She looked up. Too much, not enough. He reached past her and took the pencil from her hand. At the bottom of the list below everything else she had written, he added one line and pushed the paper back. She read it. "Be happy." She looked at him. "Figured you might forget that one." "I didn't forget it," she said quietly. "I just didn't know I was allowed." He covered her hand with his and kept it there. "Clara, you were always allowed. You have always been allowed. The people who told you otherwise were wrong, and they were wrong from the beginning, and they did not get to be right just because they said it consistently and with confidence, and to everyone who would listen." She folded the list carefully and put it in the pocket of the flannel shirt she still wore every day. It rested there against her chest, a small and specific map of the life she was choosing one line at a time in a direction entirely her own. That night she stood on the porch and looked out at the land. The cattle were dark shapes at the tree line. The sky was dense with stars from one edge of the horizon to the other. The uninterrupted sky you can only see from a place that is far enough from other people's noise and light that the darkness can be fully itself. Elijah came up behind her and his arms came around her, and she leaned back against him and felt the steady, quiet beat of his heart against her shoulder through the blue work shirt and the worn leather of the vest. She thought about the woman who had signed her name to a contract in a boarding house in Knoxville with $12 and a sewing kit and a stubbornness she had not yet learned to name accurately. She thought about the woman who had knelt in a Texas alley while 30 people watched and no one moved. She thought about all the things that had been taken and all the things that had not. The things that lived in a place too deep for shears or ash or anyone's hands. The things her father had been right about when she was 9 years old at the window of his blacksmith shop. When he had said words you have read, they can't take those. Thoughts you have thought. The knowledge of your own worth once earned cannot be unearned, no matter how many people apply themselves to the project. Elijah, she said, yeah, thank you for not saving me. He was quiet for a moment. The land stretched dark and still in every direction. Then you pulled yourself to the door. I held it open. You walked through it yourself. She turned in his arms. That is the difference, she said, between being rescued and being helped. You didn't take anything away from me, Elijah. Not one thing. You gave me the room to take back what was already mine. And that is worth more than any rescue because it means I know. I know with certainty that I can do it again if I ever have to. He pressed his forehead down to hers. Let's hope you don't have to. But if I do. If you do, he said, I will be holding the door open. She kissed him slow and sure, and behind them the cabin stood warm with lamplight spilling through the windows, and the garden grew in the dark toward whatever it was going to become. And in her pocket a list rustled softly against her heart, a map, a promise, a record of all the things that a woman who had been told she was nothing had decided on her own ground in her own time that she was going to be. The silver comb caught starlight in her hair. Clara May Whitten Cole stood on her porch. Her land, her name, her life, and she was not afraid.